The first American meal changed everything for a group of starving German prisoners. They step off a dark cattle car into sunlight and into a mess hall that smells like coffee, white bread, butter, and real meat. Men who haven't eaten properly in months stare, cry, shake, and wait for the trap. There is no trap. There are seconds. Ice cream, libraries, tractors that harvest whole villages in a day. At first it feels like kindness. Then a blank look spreads across faces trained to believe one story their whole lives. What if this kindness is not mercy, but a weapon that proves an entire war of lies wrong? If the enemy can feed you better than your own country ever did, what will you believe next? The transport train screeched to a halt at Camp Ruston, Louisiana, and Luftwaffe pilot Franz von Vera prepared to die. He'd been traveling in a cattle car for 3 days, 72 hours of darkness, the stench of unwashed bodies, and the constant fear that American guards would open fire the moment the doors slid back. Goebbels had been clear in his broadcasts. Americans tortured prisoners. They were racially inferior gangsters controlled by Jews who would work captured Germans to death in labor camps worse than anything the Reich had built. Von Vera weighed maybe 135 pounds. He'd been 180 when the war started. His Luftwaffe uniform hung on his frame like a scarecrow's costume. The last real meal he'd eaten was 6 weeks ago, a thin potato soup and a crust of black bread so hard it cut his gums when he chewed. The doors opened. Sunlight flooded in. American soldiers stood outside with rifles, but they weren't pointing them. A sergeant, heavy-set and sweating in the Louisiana heat, gestured for the prisoners to climb down. "Let's go, gentlemen. Single file. Nobody's going to hurt you." Von Vera's legs barely held his weight. He stumbled onto the gravel, squinting against the brightness. Around him, dozens of Wehrmacht soldiers shuffled forward, skeletal men with hollow eyes and the gray skin of starvation. Some couldn't walk without help. The sergeant led them across a compound toward a long wooden building. Von Vera caught a smell that made him stop mid-step. It was impossible. It had to be a hallucination. Standard for Wehrmacht soldiers in the final months of the war. White bread. Actual white bread with a golden brown crust that steamed when kitchen workers sliced it. Yellow butter, real butter, not the gray margarine substitute. Fresh vegetables, potatoes, carrots, something green he couldn't immediately identify because he hadn't seen fresh lettuce in 3 years. And meat. Portions of actual meat, sitting on plates, 1 plate for each prisoner. Von Vera's knees went weak. "Find a seat," the sergeant said. "Take your time, there's plenty." This had to be staged. Von Vera scanned the room for cameras, for American propaganda officers ready to capture images of grateful German prisoners. He saw kitchen staff, American soldiers serving food to their enemies like it was the most natural thing in the world. An American private, couldn't have been more than 20 years old, placed a tray in front of Von Vera. The plate held more food than Von Vera had seen in 6 months. The smell made him dizzy. "Coffee's over there," the private said, pointing to an urn. "Sugar if you want it. Milk too." Sugar, milk. Words from another lifetime. Von Vera looked at the men around him. Obergefreiter Muller was crying, actually crying, tears running down his face as he stared at the bread. Hauptmann Schneider, who'd commanded a fighter squadron over France, was shaking so badly he couldn't pick up his fork. They were all waiting for the same thing Von Vera was waiting for. The moment when American guards would laugh, remove the food, and reveal the cruel joke. It didn't come. Instead, the sergeant walked to the front of the room and spoke in heavily accented but understandable German. "This is your first meal. It won't be your last. You'll eat 3 times a day here. The portions are standard, same as American soldiers get. When you finish, if you're still hungry, you can have seconds. That's not a trick. That's how we do things. Seconds." The word hung in the air like something from a fairy tale. Von Vera watched Muller take a bite of bread. The man's face crumpled. and he began sobbing into his hands, bread still clutched in his fingers. Around the room, German soldiers started eating, with the desperate intensity of men who'd forgotten what. And fresh vegetables on captured enemies if you were losing the war. Von Vera had been shot down over France. He'd been interrogated by British intelligence, then transferred to American custody. Every step of the way he'd been waiting for the brutality Goebbels had promised. The torture, the starvation, the concentration camps where Americans would do to Germans what the propaganda said Americans always did to their enemies. Instead, he got a hot meal and an offer of seconds. Across the table, Schneider was eating slowly, methodically, like a man afraid this might be his last meal. But the American private came back around with a coffee pot. "Refills?" he asked. Schneider nodded, unable to speak. The private poured fresh coffee into his cup. Real coffee, not ersatz, not roasted grain, the actual thing. Von Vera forced himself to eat slowly. His stomach had shrunk. Too much food too fast would make him sick. But the temptation to devour everything in front of him was overwhelming. Around the room, men were finishing their plates. Von Vera waited for the guards to collect the trays and dismiss them. Instead, the sergeant spoke again. "Anyone still hungry? There's more in the kitchen. Don't be shy." Nobody moved. This had to be a test. This had to be the moment where American generosity revealed itself as mockery. Then Muller stood up, plate in hand, and walked to the serving line. The American cook didn't laugh, didn't refuse. He just loaded Muller's plate with another portion of everything: meat, vegetables, bread, butter. Muller returned to his seat and started eating again, still crying, still unable to process what was happening. One by one, other prisoners stood. Half the room went back for seconds. The Americans kept serving without comment, without judgment, without any sign this was unusual. Von Vera stayed in his seat. He couldn't trust this, not yet. That night, lying on a real bunk with a real mattress and actual blankets, Von Vera wrote in his diary, a small notebook he'd managed to keep hidden through his capture. His handwriting shook from exhaustion and confusion. "I thought it was a trick, a propaganda setup to photograph us eating well. I waited for them to take the food away. They never did. They brought more." He paused. Standard procedure. Von Vera had been trained to believe Americans were weak because they valued comfort and abundance over strength and sacrifice. But lying there on a comfortable bed with a full stomach for the first time in months, a terrible thought crept into his mind. What if American abundance was their strength? What if a nation that could feed its enemies this well while simultaneously fighting a global war was so powerful that everything Germany had done was meaningless from the start? He'd seen the industrial capacity of American forces, the endless supply of equipment, the casual way American units called in artillery support that would have been considered wasteful by German standards, the sheer number of aircraft, tanks, and vehicles that seemed to multiply faster than German forces could destroy them. But this was different. This was personal. This was an American private offering him sugar for his coffee like they were equals. This was a mess hall serving white bread to prisoners, while German civilians back home were eating sawdust mixed into their rations. Von Vera had been shot down defending the Reich. He'd believed in the mission, believed in the propaganda, believed that Germans were superior and that American weakness would be exposed when German strength was properly applied. Then, they gave him seconds. The next morning proved the Americans weren't lying. Breakfast was eggs, toast, oatmeal, fruit, and more coffee. Real eggs, fresh fruit. The kind of breakfast Von Vera hadn't seen since 1942. He ate slowly again, watching the American guards. They weren't gloating. They weren't making speeches about American superiority. They were just doing their jobs, serving food to prisoners like it was routine. Routine. That was the word that kept circling in Von Vera's mind. This wasn't special treatment. This wasn't a propaganda event. This was standard. This was how Americans treated their enemies every single day, which meant the propaganda had been wrong about everything. Around him, German prisoners were gaining weight. Within 2 weeks, skeletal men started filling out. Hollow cheeks gained color. The gray tinge of starvation faded as strength returned to their limbs, and conversations took on a steadier, more hopeful tone. The winter wind cut through Helmut, crawled through the frozen mud. Americans broke through at Malmedy, were pulling back. Pulling back. They'd been pulling back for months now. Since Normandy, the retreat had been one continuous nightmare of chaos, hunger, and death. Coke pressed a piece of black bread into Horner's hand, maybe 2 ounces, moldy at the edges. Your ration. Make it last. Horner stared at the pathetic scrap. In 1940, German soldiers had received fresh meat, real coffee, butter. Now they got ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns and bread so hard it could stop shrapnel. The supply lines were dead. The fatherland was dying. "What about you?" Horner asked. Coke's hollow eyes said everything. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. The artillery grew closer. American voices echoed through the trees, confident, well-fed voices, speaking a language that sounded like power itself. Horner made his choice in that frozen moment. He could die here, starving in a ditch for a regime that couldn't even feed its soldiers. Or he could surrender to the enemy and face whatever torture Goebbels had promised awaited captured Wehrmacht. He stood, raised his hands. The American GIs who took him prisoner looked like giants. Their uniforms were thick, insulated. Their cheeks had color. They moved with the easy confidence of men who'd eaten breakfast that morning. One of them, a sergeant with kind eyes, offered Horner a canteen. Real water, not melted snow strained through dirty cloth. "You speak English?" the sergeant asked. Horner shook his head. The sergeant shrugged, pulled something from his pack and handed it to Horner. A chocolate bar, a full Hershey's bar, the wrapper pristine and promising. Horner's hands shook as he unwrapped it. He'd forgotten chocolate existed. The sweetness hit his tongue like a religious experience, so intense he nearly vomited. His starved body didn't know how to process real food anymore. The sergeant watched him carefully, then said something to his squad. They laughed. Not cruel laughter, something else. Pity, maybe. 3 days later, Horner stepped off a train at Camp Butner, North Carolina. He weighed himself on a scale in the processing center. 118 pounds. Mashed with butter and milk. Carrots. Green beans. White bread that looked softer than any pillow. And coffee. Real coffee. The smell alone made Horner's knees weak. An American cook, a black man with sergeant stripes, gestured them forward with a smile. "Come on, boys. Line up. Don't be shy." One of the German prisoners, a former Panzer grenadier named Schmidt, whispered, "It's a trick. They'll photograph us eating and then take it away." Horner thought Schmidt might be right. This couldn't be real. This violated everything they'd been told about American scarcity, about how the U-boats had strangled American supply lines, about how the Depression had destroyed American agriculture. The cook began loading Horner's tray. A piece of roasted beef the size of his fist, 2 scoops of mashed potatoes, vegetables, bread with real butter. "More?" the cook asked in broken German, gesturing to the meat. Horner shook his head, unable to speak. This was already more food than he'd seen in a month. The cook added another piece anyway, winked. Horner carried his tray to a table with trembling hands. Around him, his fellow prisoners stared at their meals with expressions of pure disbelief. Several were crying silently, tears cutting tracks through the dirt on their gaunt faces. Schmidt picked up his fork, then set it down. "I can't. It's propaganda. They're watching us." But Horner was beyond caring. He cut into the meat. Juice ran across his plate. He lifted the fork to his mouth. The taste exploded across his senses. Real beef, seasoned, cooked to perfection. fat and protein his body desperately needed. He ate slowly at first, then faster. His stomach cramped immediately. Too rich, too much, too fast. He didn't care. He kept eating. Around him, the dam broke. 50 starving men attacked their food with desperate intensity. Some vomited from the richness. They kept eating. An American officer walked through the mess hall, hands clasped behind his back. He stopped at Horner's table. "You'll get 3 of these a day," he said in perfect German. "Breakfast, lunch, dinner. You can have seconds if you want. This is standard." Skin, rice, more vegetables, more bread, and dessert. An American cook placed a small bowl in front of Horner. Inside was something white and frozen, topped with chocolate sauce. "Ice cream," the cook said. "Vanilla. You like vanilla?" Horner had heard of ice cream. Rich people ate it in Berlin before the war. He'd never tasted it. He lifted the spoon. The cold hit his teeth, the sweetness, the cream, the impossible luxury of frozen dessert in the middle of winter. Schmidt was staring at his own bowl like it might explode. "They're giving us ice cream," he whispered. "They're giving frozen dessert to prisoners of war." Another German, a Luftwaffe mechanic named Werner, started laughing. Hysterical, broken laughter. "We ate shoe leather last month. They're serving us ice cream." The absurdity of it crashed over Horner like a wave. The Americans weren't just feeding them adequately. They were serving luxury items. Frozen desserts that required industrial refrigeration, stable power grids, abundant dairy production, and surplus resources. While the German High Command measured rations in moldy crusts and acorn coffee, American POW camps were producing ice cream by the thousands of gallons. Horner finished his ice cream in silence. Then he asked for seconds. The cook laughed and brought him another bowl. "Sure thing, buddy. We got plenty." We got plenty. 3 words that destroyed an empire's narrative. That night, lying in a bunk with actual sheets and a real mattress, Horner did calculations in his head. The math didn't work. To produce this much food required functioning supply lines, massive agricultural output, industrial capacity beyond imagination. A nation so wealthy it could fight a global war on multiple fronts while simultaneously feeding its enemies better than their own armies fed them. The U-boats were supposed to have starved America. The Depression was supposed to have crippled their industry. The racial inferiority of their mongrel population was supposed to have made them weak. Every single premise was a lie. Werner whispered from the next bunk. "How much food do you think they threw away today?" "What?" "The mess hall. How much went to waste?" "I saw American soldiers scraping half-eaten meals into garbage bins. Food we would have with the resources of a continent. And they'd done it while starving. The ice cream wasn't charity, it was a message. The manifest looked impossible on paper. Captain Robert Henderson stared at the numbers again, convinced someone had made a clerical error. Camp Hearn, Texas. Population, 4,800 German POWs. Daily food requisition, 2,400 pounds of beef, 1,800 pounds of potatoes, 600 pounds of fresh vegetables, 400 gallons of milk, 960 loaves of bread, plus coffee, sugar, butter, eggs, fruit. "Sir, the supply trucks are here," his clerk announced. Henderson walked to the loading dock and watched 6 trucks unload. Every single item on that absurd manifest materialized before his eyes. This happened every day, 7 days a week, at 511 camps across 46 states. He did the math in his head. The United States was feeding nearly 500,000 enemy soldiers, daily, at standards that exceeded what their own armies had provided, while simultaneously feeding 12 million American servicemen worldwide. The sheer industrial capacity required was staggering. Obergefreiter Dieter Krebs worked in the Camp Hearn kitchen. He'd been a logistics officer in the Wehrmacht before capture, trained to calculate supply lines and ration distribution. Those skills made his current assignment a daily exercise in cognitive dissonance. "These potatoes," he said to the American cook supervising him. "Where do they come from?" "Idaho. Trucked in 3 times a week." Idaho. Krebs knew his American geography. That was nearly 2,000 miles away. "You truck fresh potatoes 2,000 miles, for prisoners." "Yeah, and?" There was no and. That was the point. The Americans treated this miracle of logistics like it was routine, expected, normal. In the Wehrmacht, Krebs had watched supply officers struggle to move ammunition 50 kilometers. He'd seen entire divisions stall because fuel trucks couldn't navigate bombed roads. He'd personally calculated how to stretch a week's worth of rations across 10 days. Now he was peeling Idaho potatoes that had traveled further than most German military supplies ever moved. The farm detail at Camp Algona tractors total, shared among dozens of families. Mr. Henderson drove the tractor to a massive grain elevator at the edge of his property. Modern, mechanized, connected by rail to the outside world. "We'll harvest about 35 bushels per acre this year," Henderson said. "Not great, but decent." Huber did the math. Henderson's 640 acres, at 35 bushels each, would produce over 22,000 bushels of wheat. His family's entire 40-acre farm in Bavaria produced maybe 400 bushels in a good year. One American farmer was producing more food than his entire village. The mechanical corn picker arrived on a flatbed truck a week later. Huber stood next to Gefreiter Hans Müller, watching the massive machine get unloaded. "What is it?" Müller asked. "Corn picker, automatic." Henderson climbed up, fired the engine, and drove it into the field. The machine moved down the rows, stalks disappearing into its mechanical mouth, perfectly husked corn pouring into a wagon being pulled behind. No human hands touched the corn. The machine did everything. Henderson harvested 10 acres of corn in an afternoon, work that would have taken Huber's entire village a week. "This is why we lost," Huber said quietly in German. Müller nodded. "They don't need soldiers to fight. Their machines do the work of armies." That night, back at camp, Huber wrote in a letter home, "I have seen the future. It is mechanical, abundant, and American. When you see one of their farms, you understand the war was already over before it began." At Camp Como, Mississippi, the bread incident became legend. Unteroffizier Wolfgang Schmidt was assigned to kitchen detail. He'd been a baker in civilian life, trained in the German tradition. Precision, no waste. Every crumb mattered. The American sergeant running the kitchen operated differently. Schmidt watched him inspect a batch of rolls fresh from the oven. Good rolls, perhaps slightly darker than ideal on the bottom, but perfectly edible. In Germany, those rolls would have been devoured gratefully. The sergeant dumped the entire batch into a waste bin. "What are you doing?" Schmidt couldn't help himself. "Too dark. Not up to standard." "Standard? Those are good rolls." "Nah, we can do better." Farmers not to grow too much. Pays them not to grow? Yeah, otherwise we'd have too much surplus. Price would crash. Too much food. America's problem wasn't scarcity, it was abundance. Schmidt wrote in his diary, "They waste more than we produce. Their pigs eat better than our soldiers. This is not propaganda. This is truth that destroys everything we were told." The coffee situation at Camp Trinidad, Colorado exposed the lie most clearly. Real coffee, not the acorn substitute German soldiers had choked down for years. Actual coffee beans, roasted, ground, brewed fresh 3 times daily, with real sugar, real cream. Gefreiter Ernst Becker had been an economics student before the war. He understood trade, supply chains, resources. Coffee came from South America, thousands of miles away. During wartime, with U-boats supposedly strangling American supply lines, coffee should have been impossible to get. Yet here it was, unlimited, for prisoners. He asked the camp commander about it during one of the weekly meetings. "Coffee? Yeah, we import it from Brazil mainly, some from Colombia. But the U-boats," the commander laughed. "Son, at the peak of your U-boat campaign, You sank maybe 500 ships in a month. Know how many ships America built that same month? Over 1,000. You couldn't sink them fast enough. The numbers were absurd. Germany's greatest naval weapon, the thing that was supposed to starve America into submission, couldn't even dent their coffee supply. Becker spent days in the camp library researching American ship production. He found the numbers the commander mentioned. They were real. The Kaiser shipyards alone produced one Liberty ship every 42 days. At peak production, they built one every 24 hours. 24 hours, an entire ocean-going cargo vessel. The German shipyards took months to build one U-boat. America was building cargo ships faster than Germany could sink them, while simultaneously building the warships to hunt the U-boats, while simultaneously feeding millions of soldiers and prisoners. The industrial capacity wasn't just superior, it was overwhelming, to the point of absurdity. Hauptmann Friedrich Müller ran the numbers differently. He'd been a staff officer, trained in logistics and planning. Had books translated into German specifically for POW camps. They hired translators, printed thousands of copies, distributed them to camps nationwide. The Reich had banned most foreign books. American literature was considered degenerate. Yet here was an entire library of it, freely available, encouraging POWs to read enemy propaganda. Except it wasn't propaganda. It was just books. Mueller read The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, a devastating critique of American capitalism, showing poverty and suffering. Published in America, widely read. The author faced no consequences. In Germany, a book like that would have gotten the author sent to a camp. In America, it won prizes. The Americans weren't hiding their flaws, they were showing them openly. They had so much confidence in their system that they could afford to criticize it publicly. That realization was more devastating than any battlefield defeat. By August 1945, 6 months after Huber arrived at Camp Algona, he'd gained 35 pounds. His ribs no longer showed. His face had color. He looked healthy for the first time since 1943. He stood in the camp yard, watching a supply truck unload. Another routine delivery. Tons of food, arriving on schedule. Never late, never short. Gefreiter Richter stood next to him. "I talked to my cousin in a British camp," he said. "They're not fed like this, just thin rations, mostly tea and bread. They envy us." Huber watched the crates stack and felt the war's true boundary. Not the front line, but the endless fields, factories, and ships that made such abundance possible. The Eisenhower Doctrine wasn't born in a battlefield command tent. It was conceived in a Washington, D.C. war room in March 1943, where General George C. Marshall stood before a wall covered not with invasion maps, but with POW camp requisition forms and food production charts. "Gentlemen," Marshall said to the assembled officers, "I want you to understand something fundamental about this war. We're not just defeating Germany militarily. We're proving their entire philosophy is bankrupt." He tapped a manifest from Camp Concordia, Kansas. 4,000 calories daily per prisoner. More than German soldiers had eaten at the height of their power. The challenge isn't supply. It's making sure every camp follows the protocol exactly. No exceptions, no shortcuts. Every prisoner eats like an American soldier. The numbers they were discussing seemed impossible. By war's end, the plan called for 425,000 German POWs fed 4,000 calories daily. 511 camps across 46 states, all maintaining identical standards. 12 million pounds of food prepared daily at system peak. Zero tolerance for malnutrition or abuse. Are we really going to feed Nazis better than our own civilians under rationing? The lieutenant pressed. Yes, Eisenhower said flatly, because every pound of food we give them now saves American lives later. This isn't charity. It's the cheapest ammunition we'll ever buy. The directive went out in April 1943. Camp commanders received explicit orders. German POWs would receive the same rations as American troops stationed in the continental United States. Not similar, not comparable, identical. Captain Robert Henderson at Camp Hearn, Texas, read the order 3 times before he believed it. His camp held 4,800 Germans. The daily food requisition looked like provisions for an invasion force. 1,200 pounds of beef, 800 pounds of potatoes, 400 pounds of flour, 300 pounds of fresh vegetables, 200 pounds of butter, plus milk, eggs, coffee, sugar, and, this made Henderson laugh out loud, ice cream ingredients. "Sir, are you sure this is correct?" he asked the quartermaster sergeant. "Dead sure, Captain. Washington wants these boys eating better than they ever did in the Wehrmacht. It's psychological warfare." Henderson thought about that. "We're going to feed them into submission? Something like that. Make them realize they picked a fight with the wrong country." The strategy worked beyond anyone's predictions. At Camp McCain in Mississippi, Sergeant James Clement ran the main kitchen. He'd been a short-order cook in Detroit before the war. Now he oversaw preparation of 3 meals daily for thousands of German prisoners. "First month, they acted like we were fattening them up for something terrible," Clement recalled decades later. "They'd hide bread in their bunks, wrap extra food in napkins, and stuff it in their pocket." Calculating. If America could do this for its enemies, what did that say about everything they'd been told? Gefreiter Werner Schmitz worked in the Camp McCain kitchen alongside Clement. A former Wehrmacht cook, he understood food logistics intimately. What he saw in Mississippi broke something fundamental in his understanding of the war. "In Germany, our entire battalion shared 1 cow per week," Schmitz said in a 1946 interview. "Here, one camp received more meat in a day than my division saw in a month. And this was for prisoners, for the enemy." He watched American supply trucks arrive daily with provisions that seemed endless. Fresh vegetables from California, beef from Texas, flour from Kansas, butter from Wisconsin, coffee from South America. "The American sergeant, he showed me the requisition forms," Schmitz continued, "just for our camp. Every week, enough food to feed a small German city. And there were hundreds of camps. I asked him, 'How is this possible?' He said, 'This is just a fraction of what we produce.' I understood then. The war was already over. We just didn't know it yet." The deliberate generosity extended beyond just calories. American commanders engineered the POW food system to deliver specific psychological impacts. At Camp Concordia, Kansas, German prisoners worked in camp kitchens under supervision of Sergeant Thomas Patterson. He made sure they saw exactly how much food America possessed. "I'd have them inventory the warehouse every week," Patterson said. Stacks of flour bags 10 feet high, entire rooms filled with canned goods, meat lockers bigger than their barracks. I wanted them to see it wasn't a trick or a temporary thing. This was normal American abundance. Obergefreiter Dieter Krebs, a former Wehrmacht logistics officer working under Patterson, kept detailed notes of what he witnessed. His diary entry from June 1944 reads, "Today I counted supplies in the main warehouse. By my calculation, enough food for our 3,000 prisoners for 6 months. The sergeant says they restock every 2 weeks. He's not lying. I've watched the deliveries. This camp alone receives more provisions than my entire division saw during the invasion of Poland. How do you fight a nation with this much surplus? We were doomed from the Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. He couldn't comprehend it. In Germany, we banned books, burned them, controlled all information. Here, they gave us access to their own self-criticism. They showed us Americans arguing with each other in their newspapers, criticizing their own government openly. The education officer, Captain Edward Davison, explained the strategy to Mueller directly. Democracy means disagreement, Hauptmann. It means workers can strike. Newspapers can criticize. Politicians can lose elections. You've been told this makes us weak. Instead, I want you to see it makes us stronger. You can have unity without uniformity. Mueller attended voluntary classes on American government. Over 80% of Camp Como's prisoners participated. They watched newsreels showing congressional debates, labor disputes, political campaigns. They showed us their chaos, Mueller said, and called it freedom. At first, I thought they were fools. Then I realized, this chaos had built the most powerful nation on earth. While we marched in lockstep to defeat, they argued their way to victory. The food made the ideological conversion possible. You cannot maintain faith in your superior civilization while eating better as a prisoner than you ever did as a conqueror. General Eisenhower monitored the program personally. He received weekly reports from camp commanders detailing prisoner weight gain, morale changes, and ideological shifts. A memorandum from July 1944 noted, average weight gain among German POWs now 15 to 20 pounds after 60 days in custody. Mortality rate from all causes, 0.15%, primarily accidents. No deaths from malnutrition. Contrast with German-held American POWs experiencing 37% mortality rate in Japanese camps, estimated 10 to 15% in German camps. Eisenhower circulated the comparison deliberately among military planners. This is why we fight, he wrote in the margin. Not just to defeat tyranny, but to prove democracy works better. These numbers are our proof. The strategy's true genius became apparent when German POWs started writing home. The War Department encouraged it, knowing censored but honest letters would devastate civilian morale in Germany more effectively than bombing raids. By January 1945, German military intelligence was sounding alarms. Tell you the truth, I am eating better here as a prisoner than I did as a soldier in France. Better than we ate at home before the war. The Americans give us real coffee, fresh meat, white bread with butter. Today we had ice cream for dessert. Ice cream. While our people starve, our enemies feast, and they share it with us. I don't understand this war anymore. His wife showed the letter to neighbors. They showed it to others. Within weeks, dozens of families in Hamburg were questioning whether the war was worth continuing. Multiply that effect across cities and towns, across thousands of letters and conversations, and German civilian confidence in victory eroded, quietly, steadily, irreversibly. The smell hit Ernst Frumgen before he even entered the bakery at Camp Aliceville, Alabama. Fresh bread, real yeast, actual wheat flour, not the sawdust-mixed ersatz garbage he'd been baking in Bavaria for 2 years. The American sergeant gestured him inside. You're a baker, right? Good, you'll work here. Frumgen stood frozen in the doorway. The bakery stretched before him like something from a pre-war dream. Industrial mixers, each capable of handling 50 pounds of dough. 3 massive ovens, all fired and ready. Sacks of flour stacked floor to ceiling, hundreds of them, more white flour than he'd seen in 5 years of war. How many prisoners? He asked in broken English. 3,000 here. We bake for all of them, plus the guards. Frumgen did the math. 30,000 rolls daily. The number made him dizzy. His entire village in Bavaria couldn't produce that much in a week. The American cook, a cheerful corporal named Murphy, handed him an apron. Watch first, then you'll take over tomorrow. For 2 hours, Frumgen watched Murphy and 2 other Americans work. They moved with casual efficiency, mixing dough in quantities that seemed impossible. The flour flowed freely. No measuring, no rationing, no careful conservation of every precious gram. Then it happened. Murphy pulled a tray from the oven. The rolls were golden brown on top, slightly darker on the edges, perfectly edible, delicious even. Murphy frowned. Ah, hell, overbrowned. He walked to a waste bin and dumped the entire tray. 4 potato peels for soup. And here, in America, they fed better bread than he'd eaten in years to livestock. In Germany, he said slowly, we would kill for that bread. Murphy's expression shifted, softened. Yeah, he said quietly. I know. That's why you lost. The words weren't cruel, just factual, and devastating. The letters started arriving in Germany in late 1944, carried by neutral Swedish ships and Red Cross channels. They came from camps scattered across 46 American states, written by 425,000 German POWs. Wehrmacht soldier Otto Haufler wrote to his wife in Stuttgart from Camp Shelby, Mississippi. The Americans feed us 3 meals daily. Real meat, fresh bread, vegetables I haven't seen since before the war. There is coffee, actual coffee, not ersatz, with sugar and milk. I have gained weight. The guards are firm but not cruel. I don't understand. We were told they would starve us. His wife showed the letter to neighbors. The neighbors whispered to friends. Within weeks, dozens of families in Stuttgart were receiving similar letters. The Gestapo noticed. A captured German military intelligence report from January 1945, found in Berlin archives after the war, stated, "Urgent. Morale crisis developing from POW correspondence." Letters from American camps describe abundant food, humane treatment, educational opportunities. This directly contradicts official information about American war conditions and treatment of prisoners. Soldiers' families are expressing doubt in official reports. Recommend immediate censorship of all POW mail from American sources. Too late. The truth was a flood they couldn't stop. Gefreiter Hans Becker wrote from Camp Trinidad, Colorado. Today we had roasted chicken for lunch. Chicken. When did we last eat chicken in Germany? 1941? The Americans have so much food they give seconds, thirds if you want. I weigh 175 pounds now. I was 145 when captured. Mother, I think we have been lied to about everything. The letters came with a subtext the German censors couldn't catch. If America could feed its enemies this well during wartime, what did that say about their actual strength? Hauptmann Wilhelm Schäfer, The German people are starving. Their soldiers in our camps are gaining weight. This contrast is impossible to explain away with propaganda. The Americans didn't just allow the letters, they encouraged them. Camp commanders reminded POWs of their right to write home weekly. The Red Cross facilitated delivery. The letters were censored for military information but nothing else. One letter described the ice cream. Another detailed the camp baseball games. A third mentioned the camp newspaper, printed in German, with uncensored American news. Each letter was a small bomb detonating in the foundation of the Nazi worldview. But the Americans went further. At Camp Como, Mississippi, Captain Edward Davison stood before 200 German POWs in a makeshift classroom. Behind him, a 16mm projector hummed. "Today," he said in fluent German, "we're going to watch an American newsreel. What you'll see is real, unedited. This is what Americans see in their movie theaters every week." The lights dimmed. The projector flickered to life. The newsreel showed Congress in session. Senators arguing, shouting, disagreeing vehemently about war strategy. Then it cut to factory workers on strike in Detroit. Picket lines. Demands for higher wages. The camera didn't hide it. Hauptmann Friedrich Müller, sitting in the front row, felt his confusion deepen. This was supposed to show American strength? It looked like chaos, disorder, weakness. Then the newsreel showed what those same Detroit factories produced when the workers went back. B-24 bombers rolling off the line at Willow Run, one every 63 minutes. Tanks, trucks, artillery, mountains of equipment. The screen showed American soldiers in Europe, well-fed, well-equipped, advancing. The newsreel ended with families at home, women working in factories, children collecting scrap metal. Everyone contributing, voluntarily. The lights came up. "Questions?" Davison asked. Mueller raised his hand slowly. "You show us your country arguing with itself, your workers striking, your politicians fighting. You admit your problems openly. Why?" Davison smiled. "Because that's democracy. We don't hide our disagreements. We argue, we debate, we fight with words and votes." Educational programs weren't mandatory. That was crucial. The Americans didn't force anyone to attend classes or watch newsreels. They simply made them available. 80% of POWs participated. They attended lectures on American government, studied the Constitution, read the Federalist Papers in German translation, watched films showing American cities, farms, schools, churches. What shocked them wasn't American perfection. The films didn't hide poverty, racism, labor disputes. What shocked them was American transparency. They admit their failures, Obergefreiter Klaus Richter wrote in his diary at Camp Algona, Iowa. They argue about how to fix them. In public, in newspapers, on the radio. And somehow they still function. They still produce. They still win. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Nazi ideology insisted that strength required absolute unity, total control, elimination of dissent. Hitler's word was law. Debate was treason. Order came through force. Yet here was America, chaotic, argumentative, diverse, individualistic, and utterly dominant. Unteroffizier Werner Schmitz, working in the camp kitchen at Camp McCain, Mississippi, tried to reconcile this paradox. He'd watched American cooks waste food that would feed his family for a week. He'd seen the endless supplies. He'd read newspapers showing factory strikes and congressional battles. "How do they do it?" he asked Sergeant Clement one night. Clement thought for a moment. "My granddad came from Germany, 1887, couldn't speak English, had nothing. He became a farmer in Kansas, built a good life, raised my dad, sent him to college." He paused. Nobody forced him. Nobody controlled him. He just had freedom to work and keep what he earned. That's the secret. Millions of people working for themselves, not for some Führer. Turns out free men produce more than slaves. Schmitz lay awake that night thinking. By March, it was clear the correspondence and programs had succeeded beyond expectation. The flood of first-hand accounts had become impossible to suppress, and the narrative the Nazi regime had maintained for years was unraveling.